The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of Oshkosh Media, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
To 2019 and our first show of the year. I'm Cheryl Hentz, and you're watching Eye on Oshkosh, and very pleased to be joined tonight by two people who have been on the show a number of times. To my left is our state representative from the 54th Assembly District, Gordon Hintz. I say Hintz because my name's Hentz, and people over the years have gotten us confused.
It does happen.
It's with an E and with an I, so not spelt the same and no relation. And to my right is esteemed defense attorney and environmentalist and legal eagle George Curtis. George is with the Apex Law Firm. Is that the official title? Or
that's correct. It's a division of Curtis Law.
Okay. But you also host two programs here on Cable Access and on YouTube. It's Your Law and It's Your Environment. So
I do, and I've been doing that for maybe about 10 years, and sometimes I fight you for guests.
Yeah. Well, we never want that. We hope that they share their time, so that's good. But I'm glad you're both here. So we want to talk about a lot of things. We want to talk about all the stuff going on in Madison. We want to talk about new laws for 2019. Since you are an environmentalist, let's talk about the lame duck session. And I want to know why it's called the lame duck session. Where in the world did that name where did that ever come from? Does anyone
George,
know?
this has to be you that answers this, right?
Well, I am not as knowledgeable as Gordy is about that, but my impression is it's called a lame duck because it's at the end of a term there's going to be a new group taking over power of one of the branches shortly, and so that the old group, while they still have their hands on the throat of the government, try to ram some things through that just to make it difficult and challenging and uphill for the group that's succeeding them.
Well, boy, did they ever ram things through this time, and they were anything but lame ducks in doing it. It's a power grab, basically, what they've done to Governor-elect Tony Evers, and we're taping this on the 3rd of January. By the time you see it, he will probably be Governor Tony Evers, but also what they've done to the incoming Attorney General, Josh Kaul. So let's talk a little bit about what they've done and where this is headed from a litigation standpoint, because there's going to be a legal challenge, isn't there?
Absolutely. It was really disappointing. It represents sort of a change in politics that we just haven't seen in Wisconsin, that we really haven't seen nationally, where you have a democratically elected governor, and then before they're even sworn in, you have the existing group of legislators change the law and undermine the powers of the democratically elected governor. In this case, the biggest things to do are the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and a lot of that occurs in state agencies. And of course, what they did was really took back that power to essentially execute the laws themselves by having oversight on individual rules, by having confirmation of the cabinet secretaries and other positions. Mm-hmm. And they made a litany of other changes that were released in 43 different motions and 143 41 pages, 72 hours before they passed it through. Clearly, there's a violation of separation of powers there. I mean, we learn about the different branches of government. This is a legislature that simply is rejecting the will of the voters. Governor Evers was elected to do and use many of those powers, especially at state agencies that have been really politicized, whether it's the DNR or the Department of Transportation. They want him to have that, be able to shape those agencies as he sees fit, and he no longer has that same power that he was elected to use.
Well, and it's interesting, I think, because, it was Robin Voss, I think, who said, oh, this is a great thing. This is a good thing. This actually gives him more power. And I'm sitting there on the other end of the TV saying, that's a load of BS. If it was that great, you guys would have done it when your boy was in the governorship, sitting in that chair, So from a legal standpoint, George, other states have tried something similar to this. I don't think quite to this extent, but it's been deemed unconstitutional elsewhere.
In North Carolina, I believe it was held to be unconstitutional. I think it will be held in large part to be unconstitutional here too. But in the meantime, Governor Evers is crippled. While that goes through the process of the court system, so it has an effect on making it difficult for him to achieve any of the goals that he campaigned on, the very things that he said that he would do if he were governor, and he was elected. They took away the election, actually, and they did the same thing with the Attorney General. Some of the legislation that I think that should be explained is the situation where the Attorney General is no longer the attorney whenever the legislature decides that they want their own private attorney at taxpayer dollars. Remember when Evers was secretary of the educational department, the governor tried to force on him the AG representing him in a case that really was against him. And he had to go to the Supreme Court and have that declared to be unconstitutional. It's all changed now.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that they've done with part of this stuff is they've restricted the amount of time in which you can do early voting. And I think that's very directly disenfranchising voters, much like when they put through, the voter ID legislation years ago.
This, for all the talk about, the focus on, it's just, balancing powers and things that we should have done. This was in direct response. They're trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. We should make it easier for people to vote. In fact, really hats off to the Oshkosh City Clerk. We had our first day of weekend voting. I think more than 150 people voted on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks before the election. That means there were smaller lines on election day as a result of that. Limiting it to 2 weeks in high population centers just forces there to be more lines, make it less likely and more difficult for places to vote. That was already struck down in court earlier when they've tried this, and the fact that they've really just rewritten the law and are going to make it go to courts again is really a cynical attempt that's not really masked. It is what it is. They're trying to make it harder to vote.
Well, one of the things that, and I just read this today, Governor-elect Evers was interviewing with somebody, and I just read this, like I said. He says that he's not going to go along with any of these laws, that they are going to have to sue him if they really want to keep these things in place that they've rammed through, they'll have to sue him. But that's all great and well to say that, but at the end of the day, no city clerk or county clerk is going to challenge the law, and say, nope, I'm going to just let people come and do early voting whenever they want. That's not going to happen. So it's great that Evers is going to stand up to this legislation, but it's not going to make things easier for people wanting to vote.
I think there are so many different components in the overall package. There were things that make it easier to comply with tax credits without reporting the actual jobs. There's a ton of things in there that haven't received a lot of attention. I think part of it is like in North Carolina, where there have been challenges, and some I think the courts have decided, and some are still in litigation. What happens if there's a court case? Do we go back to what the existing law or the previous law was, or what the new law is? And I think he was maybe speaking more to his attempt to comply with what it would be should litigation or when litigation comes forward. Mm-hmm. So it does throw into question what the law is and who is ultimately in control. And I think, there's some frustration in, as George mentioned, I mean, the governor was elected to do many of the things by the public. Yep. And you really no longer have the voters in charge if you take away that power, which has been done.
Sure. One of the other things that this was in Wednesday's news, sorry. Governor-elect Evers said that he may just veto the entire budget. Now, we know that when budgets are passed, there are certain bills, certain other pieces of legislation attached to budgets. If he vetoes the budget, and either one of you can answer this, or both can, because I'm trying to understand the mechanics of how this works. If he were to veto the budget, does that then also nullify whatever other legislation was attached to that budget? Or can he somehow do away with veto the budget, but not the legislation that went along with it? I mean, this is a bunch of stuff. I wanted to say something else, but it's a bunch of junk, really.
So the governor, the executive branch, even with the changes, still has considerable power in Wisconsin. It's one of the strongest executives in the country, and has the line item veto power, even though we've lessened that power. We don't allow them to create new words and those sort of things with an amendment that was voted on by the public a few years ago. I think what you're going to see is Governor Evers is going to introduce a budget, but that the Republican-controlled legislature is also going to introduce a budget, and they may be very different. And then the process going forward, the legislature may pass a budget through the Assembly, through the Senate, and then the governor may veto the entire thing if it looks vastly different from what he's done. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, how do you compromise versus will the compromise happen individually? Will we say, let's take transportation and vote on that separately? Can we fund schools? Are we going to work off of last year's budget and just do an inflationary increase? It's unclear. There will be some gamesmanship, but there should be things that we can agree on. And maybe the best thing to do would be let's get those done, take those off the table, and figure out where the differences are. But my guess is, there's going to be some political things put in there, and really there's going to be a fight for public opinion. And I think Tony Evers is in good shape with the budget that's going to reflect what the values of the voters were this fall. Mm-hmm.
I think that Governor Evers is an unknown quality to many of us. You probably know him better. I've met him, actually. I had him on my television show back a few years ago. And he doesn't approach things as a lawyer does. He doesn't seem to approach things like our president does, of in your face. I think he's been very successful in education, but that's all I know about him. Maybe you can enlighten us as to his style.
I will say this. I think Tony Evers was elected because of exactly, he's not an ideologue. I think he's interested in, I don't think he wants to be president. I think he ran for governor because he cares about our kids. He cares about investing in our schools. He wants to protect our natural resources, and he wants to govern. It's not about his ambition, and I think he wants to restore Wisconsin's tradition in a state that really had become over-politicized. And I think his demeanor, his authenticity has been something that's refreshing. This didn't come across as the most charismatic, motivated, ambitious guy in the world, and I think that was really a contrast to what Governor Walker was, and I've been really pleasantly surprised, not even surprised, just he's been steady. He's, speaking with confidence about what his priorities are and not wavering from those. And I think he's putting together a good team. And, he's going to Lincoln Hills in his first week. We couldn't get Governor Walker to visit an institution in his first 8 years. I think sending a signal to both state employees and to some of our troubled kids that, we're going to try to have a corrections policy that keeps people safe, but also reinvests in the future. So I'm very encouraged. And I think there's a real opportunity to hopefully, come together and get back to governing on the big issues that matter to people.
Well, that would be a refreshing change that I think all of us would applaud. I just don't know that. I hope you're right. I hope we're going to see it, but we're not seeing it in Washington. I don't know that we're going to see it in Madison, but I hope that we will, because it is high time that people stop fighting. One side of the aisle fighting with the other side, come together and focus on the issues that are important to the people that you were elected to serve. If they would all just do that, I don't think there would be all these problems, all this filibustering, government shutdowns, which we're going to get to in a little bit. We wouldn't have all this silliness. We would have politicians on either side of the aisle focusing on what's important to people. And so, anyway, with that, let's talk about some new state and federal laws, because I want to talk about Trump. I want to talk about the government shutdown, but we're going to be on that for a while. So before we get to that, let's talk about new laws that have taken effect as of either January 1st or that will be taking effect very soon.
Well, the legislature was busy. I was only involved as a part of my trial lawyers organization in terms of concerns of what the conservatives called tort reform. And there were some tort reform bills passed. There were some others presented that have not yet passed. And let's talk about what is tort reform. Tort reform means that the establishment of insurance, government, and industry reduce the ability of a victim of a bad product or an insurance-related incident of negligence or something like that, reduce the chances of making a recovery, limit the recovery with caps, provide immunities, shorten the statutes of repose, and do anything they can do to make it more difficult for the victim of a bad product or bad treatment to recover. There are always these bills in every legislature. The Koch brothers support this kind of legislation. There's a group called ALEC that actually writes most of these bills for the Republican Party across the country. And the Republican Party doesn't always, but usually adopts the bill word for word. An example is that the mining bill in northern Wisconsin was designed by, in part, that group and in part the mining company that thought they were going to get the job. But at any rate, in the last legislature, there has been enough give and take, and some people who were looking out for the consumer, that the bills that did pass were not as strong as we feared they would be, or as they started out to be, which means that some of the people like Gordon Hintz were doing their job. They didn't have 6 bullets in their revolver, but they used the 2 they had. And so I think the consumers have lived through that. Of course, some of this is still pending. The conservatives intend to attack collateral source, for example, which benefits insurance companies and not victims who bought the insurance and things like that. So it's a continuing battle, but there were some accomplishments, I felt, in the last legislature. It didn't turn out as bad as we feared it would.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something called ALEC. Is that an acronym for a PAC or a super PAC, or is that a lobbying organization? What is ALEC?
You probably know better than I do where it came from. It's my understanding is it's funded by big corporate money to squeeze out the tort system. They have constant propaganda that we're having a litigation explosion, even though we aren't. We have fewer cases than we had 10 years ago, and then we had fewer than 10 years before. And there are 0 med mal verdicts in Wisconsin in the year 2018. I mean, it's all based on propaganda, but I've never seen a Republican candidate that didn't talk about
Yeah, I think it's the like the American Legislative Exchange Council, but it's funded by a lot of groups that have an agenda. What we've seen really nationally is there are think tanks on both sides that sort of push model legislation through each state, and if they're successful somewhere, they'll move to somewhere else as a way to sort of get around. If you can't get it done at the national level, move it through the states, and they've been successful with a lot of the Republican legislatures at limiting the consumer rights, and some other things.
All right. Before we started taping, George, you were talking about new laws with respect to, like, for example, workers' compensation. Tell us about that?
Yes, well, it's a part of the whole package. Under the Walker administration, the rights of workers' compensation claimants have been limited. They had collateral source laws that have not yet been passed, but they haven't given up on them. The civil procedure that we referred to earlier is another attack on the rights of people to successfully sue. I believe the statute of repose has been, in terms of old products, has been reduced from 15 years to 10 years, so that that product becomes immune, even though that there might be tractors out there that are 65 years old. Lady called me today. She went through a porch and broke her leg, and we have to find out how old that porch is. Because these are all just limitations on consumers' rights to benefit insurance companies and benefit people who produce products, and that's where the contributions come at election time.
Sure.
We all are special interest. I represent different special interests than the people who are supporting the Republican Party and the conservatives.
Yep. One law that I had just heard about this week in the news that is a new law. It's a federal law, but it requires hospitals to post their prices on their websites. And it's a federal thing, so it's going to affect hospitals across the country, including here in Wisconsin. Not anything you guys passed, but I would just kind of like to, I guess, hear both your thoughts on this, because as I sit and think about it, I'm thinking, okay, well, that's great, but under most people's insurance, you're part of a group, and you can't really just pick and choose where you want to go. Say you need a knee replaced or a shoulder replaced or whatever. You can't just pick and choose what hospital you want to go to. So I see where it's good just because it's disclosure, but it's not going to, I think, change where people go for healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, for years we've been talking about the need to have more transparency, but because of our healthcare system is so complex between who's insured, who's not, sometimes you have a negotiated rate for what they'll pay for a certain service if you're a part of one plan versus what they'll compensate for another plan. It's probably most beneficial. I mean, I always said, like, I had an appendicitis. I'm not going to shop around for who's going to take it out for the lowest cost.
And I remember when that happened.
Happened during a debate. But the other side of it is if you have elective surgery and you do have that option, certainly we want people to be more aware. It is a part of our system that I think does have an impact on cost, but maybe it will. The additional scrutiny by the transparency, can help us focus more on what is the driving costs of healthcare and how we can better, manage those costs. So it's a part of the healthcare discussion, but you're right. I mean, it's hard to get apples to apples across the board given how we choose to pay for healthcare in our country.
Sure.
Well, I agree. And the sad part of healthcare, is how expensive it is. It's not available to many people. I can't believe a country as great as this one can't provide health care to everybody. And the only people who pay retail are poor people without insurance.
Yeah.
Everybody else has got a deal through their insurance company. They get a discount, but the individual who comes in off the street who doesn't have insurance pays retail.
Yeah, it's true. It is true. Well, let's talk about the government shutdown. It's going to probably eat up part of our time here, a good chunk of it, but that's fine. We are, as of this taping, in the midst of our third government shutdown under the Trump administration. He keeps saying things in his tweets that he's putting out. Oh, shutdowns are a good thing for the government. And it was a discussion that was televised. It wasn't a press conference. But he just before this last government shutdown now, he said, he'd be proud to shut down the government for border security. This is just asinine. And I don't know where it's going to end. He said he'd take responsibility for it, but now he won't take responsibility for it. How does he think that this is going to benefit him when it comes time for his reelection? You've got an awful lot of people out there, hundreds of thousands of people who aren't getting paid, and some will get their money, though later. Others may not see any money. How is this going to benefit this guy?
I mean, it's not leadership. It's unbecoming of a president, and it's unclear, what his motivations are at the end. I mean,
Well, he wants his wall.
Well, but the legislative process is all about compromise. I mean, that's how it ultimately works. And if the president and the Republican Party are in control of Congress and the executive branch, and they can't get what he wants to get done. I don't know how he expects now with a Democratic Congress those things to ultimately happen. Playing games with people's lives, playing games with the services that impact people's lives, whether it's our national parks or our ability to get our taxes filed and refunded, I think you're going to start to see cracks. But for anybody that cares about taxpayer waste, every time you have something like this where you have a stop and a start up again, costs billions and billions of dollars. Someone highlighted this at the last time that we had a shutdown, and our inability to address some of the long-term solutions, at any level are the things that keep making, I think the public is immune because we've heard shutdown every year for the last 5 years. But, it has very real impact on people's lives and very real impact on taxpayers.
And you mentioned about how it's not good for the economy and how it costs so much money. In prepping for this show, I did a little bit of research. During the 2013 shutdown, which would have been under Obama, on October 16th, it was stated that the shutdown had then, to date, taken $24 billion out of the economy and shaved at least 0.6% off our annualized fourth quarter gross domestic product. So, $24 billion out of the economy, and that shutdown didn't last that long. So I can only begin to imagine what this most recent shutdown that we're involved in is going to end up costing.
And investors who follow and invest in the stock market seem to be a little shaky right now and loss of confidence. And if there's anything that would cause somebody to have a loss of confidence, it's what's going on in Washington with the uncertainty, the hostility, the throwing down of the sword and challenging. And as Gordy pointed out, after all, the president was a Republican. Both houses of Congress were Republican. They've wired the Supreme Court so that they've got that covered with a conservative majority. And now he's going to blame the Democrats. Really, that they've been firing an empty gun.
Yeah. Well, and of course, this all comes down to his wanting $5 billion for the southern border to have this wall. And he keeps changing his opinion on what it's going to be called or whatever. It's a wall. That's the bottom line. What he wants is a wall. And I don't know that he's going to get his wall. I don't think that's going to happen. The Democrats have said, well, we may put forth some kind of a compromise related to DACA or the Dreamers. They may put forth some other kind of compromise, but at the end of the day, they're not going to give him $5 billion for a wall. So when you said, Gordon, about that this is about compromise, that is what it's about, but that's also a word that I don't see being in his vocabulary.
It's about rational people compromising. And
well, that's another word that's
I'm not sure that we have that right now.
No, we don't have anyone rational sitting in that role. So
No.
I don't see how this is going to have a good ending. It'll end.
And it's increasingly, I mean, look, I'm pretty dialed in at the state level, and we certainly have our own challenges, but politics is pretty broken, and having someone in charge that seems to be willing to roll the dice and just be freewheeling might be refreshing to people that want to burn it all down, but we're breaking up longstanding alliances internationally that provide stability, both economically and in international relations. And we're also, risking our economic stability domestically as well. I mean, certainty is so important. And if there's one thing we don't have with this president, it is certainty. And, I don't know who's advising him anymore. And
he doesn't listen to advice anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I've disagreed with past presidents, but I was always able to sleep at night. That's not the case anymore.
Well, you talk about, relationships with what still are our allies, but which used to be, I think, probably stronger allies. And his pulling out of certain agreements that have been made in good faith over the years and what have you. I think, and I'd like your opinion on this, you guys, it seems to me that at the end of the day, once he leaves office, those allies are going to say, well, you have to consider the source. Let's look at who was in power at the time that this breakdown sort of occurred. And they may be willing to forgive that and come back and be a strong ally of the United States of America once again. But by the same token, certain things you can't just forgive and forget so easily. And so it seems to me that long term, these are some relationships that are being harmed.
I don't think there's any question about that. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that seems to be some of the intent, is to sort of disrupt really the global order that has been established post World War II, that has led to a lot of our strategic alliances, that has brought peace, cooperation, or at least the order of cooperation. And if we want to revisit some of those things, great. If we want to revisit some of these trade deals, or great. But the sort of burn it down, hostile approach that we don't care if it all breaks down. When you hear longstanding allies of ours say they can no longer rely on the U.S. to be a global leader, we cede that authority to someone else. So if we're fearful of Russia or China having increasing influence, we're allowing that to happen. The vacuum will be there when we pull home. So it might be popular to say, well, we should focus here first, but we reduce our influence in the rest of the world, and we're automatically interconnected. And our allies will find other people to rely on if it's not us. And so, there's definitely an audience for what President Trump is selling, but it comes with great consequence in a way that I don't think people totally understand.
Well said.
I agree. I think that the president's inability to deal with Russia, giving the impression that the Russian leader, Putin, has something on him, that he's afraid to fight for our country, is scary. His attraction to despots of any kind, his falling in love with the North Korean president. Of course, he did the same thing with Stormy Daniels, but I don't know how she felt about that. But he really isn't representing our country's values.
No.
When he finds people like that in Saudi Arabia attractive, much more attractive than dealing with Americans that are trying to help him with our country and in Congress.
Well, he seems to be running the country like he does his companies, his corporation. And, you know, for years we've heard people say, you have to run government like a business. Well, to one degree or another, I guess that's true. But at the end of the day, there are certain steps that have to be taken in order to accomplish certain things to be passed or not passed, or he can't just single-handedly do some of the things that he wants to do. And I don't think he understands that because he's accustomed to living in a corporate world where he is at the top of the hierarchy and everything flows down from there. And if he says jump, people say how high and when do you want me to jump? And that's not how government works, thank God.
This must be record turnover for a cabinet, isn't it?
Easily. And I think that's the one thing that, you know, is most, I think, concerning is that the president surrounded himself with many capable people, at least initially. But when you have that kind of turnover and you have respected people leaving, saying, you know, and the president really being dismissive of them, that's what really gives you pause about who's really in charge and who has the president's ear to be able to provide the counsel. I mean, when you're an executive in an impossible job, you need to be able to synthesize a lot of good information from people who know what they're talking about in a short amount of time to make decisions. And the president seems way too interested in, you know, what's on cable news, his own Twitter feed, to put the kind of investment needed on what are really complex issues. And we haven't seen anything like this. And you know, we just got to hang on.
It's going to be a bumpy ride. It has been so far. But one other thing, while we're talking about his desire to do things somewhat unilaterally, now last week, and again we're taping this on January 3rd, but last week he said that he may have to just close the southern border. As a lawyer, as a lawmaker, how can he just single-handedly, unilaterally close a border? He can't, can he? I mean, is that not one of the most unconstitutional things that he could do?
Well, I certainly think so. At the same time, the way government works, he can, if he orders troops, do something that is patently unconstitutional, and by the time it gets fixed, the damage has been done. And he's so impulsive. He makes up stories as he goes along. The first thing he said about the problem with the border was that it was Obama's fault, and he couldn't do anything about it. Then he said it was Congress's fault, and they ought to fix it, and he couldn't fix it under the Constitution. Then he made the executive order, which was just what he said he couldn't do. And I think he had 2 or 3 other versions in there, but it doesn't seem to stop him. He can change every hour and pretend he never said the first 6 things.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there is a real complex issue related to immigration reform that needs to be discussed, that needs to be worked on, that's very difficult, that probably only can get us to managing it. But it doesn't involve the current dialogue that's being promoted by President Trump that really has nothing to do with safety, security, or dealing with the influx of families that are, a lot of them, refugees coming from unstable situations. And the longer that we get sidetracked with, you know, this shutdown over wall funding, the less we are dealing with the real issue that we need to related to immigration reform.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit about the Mueller investigation and where it may be headed. Of course, you know, a few of Trump's own cronies back in the day have now fallen by the wayside and either have done some prison time or are in the process of doing some prison time. And, you know, before all this crap hit the fan, he couldn't stop singing their praises enough. You know, now that they've sort of ratted him out and have gone the way they should have gone in the first place, which is being honorable and true, Now all of a sudden they're liars, they're bad people, they're this, they're that. I mean, where is this thing going? Are we ever going to see him be gotten for something with respect to this Russia probe?
It'll be interesting to see. I think one thing that's going to change next week is once Democrats control the House, they'll have subpoena power. I think they're going to subpoena the tax returns that every president that's run and been elected has had to submit before. I'm assuming that the Mueller investigation will conclude. There are already a lot of dots out there that have been connected that under any previous administration would be enough to topple them for either impeachment or resignation. The question is, what is the new standard that exists? There's obviously a divide in this country where no standard exists for how many lies, how many mistakes, how many crossing of the line takes place for people to defend this guy. But at some point, I think depending on what comes out, you will see a president imperiled by either criminal charges, the potential for resignation, or not to run again.
Okay. You mentioned his tax returns possibly being subpoenaed. Legal question for you then, George, because I don't think that it is a requirement or a mandate that someone running for president release their tax returns. I don't know, I don't remember from my history lessons how far back this goes, but someone somewhere along the way started doing that, and it just was a tradition, I guess we'll call it, that was carried on by every other presidential candidate until this one. Can we, since it's not a legal requirement, can we subpoena his tax returns?
I agree with you. It's not a legal requirement, and I believe as part of any investigation, they can and will be subpoenaed, but then that goes to the Supreme Court as to whether that is a...
And there we are again.
Snap.
And, that church is rigged.
Yeah, I mean, and there is no higher authority.
No.
So
well, the authorities differ on that, but...
Well, I know, but that's sort of where it would end up. That would be a lame duck.
Sure. It's who gets to count the cards. And that's why the Supreme Court is so very, very important. The most important thing that Trump's administration will have accomplished, if the country survives it, is that he will have set the court up with a lot of people who may serve for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and they will in many ways run the country. This lifetime appointment thing is coming back to bite us.
Yeah, it should not be. Let's talk about health care reform, because we're down to about 15 minutes yet. Health care reform, especially now that part of the Affordable Care Act has been ruled unconstitutional by a judge, where do we see it going?
Well, we don't know, because there are so many district federal courts, and they differ on many, many issues. And it takes a while, but eventually it will go up to the Supreme Court, I assume, and part of it can be found constitutional and part of it unconstitutional.
And there we are again.
There we are again. It's a glacier. The simple fact is that we can afford to make sure that everybody in this great country has access to medical treatment, and we should. We should make sure that everybody, poor people and people who are injured and handicapped and elderly, have access to competent medical care. Mm-hmm. And many of the people who would normally vote the conservative side have made clear recently and in the last election they don't want to return to the pre-existing condition. They want coverage, and I think public opinion will eventually decide that issue.
Sure.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that's changed on this whole discussion is the fact that, the premise of Obamacare was to provide coverage for people that had pre-existing conditions that could not previously have access to affordable health insurance or would simply get dropped. That public opinion's been decided and fought, and of course, if the Affordable Care Act gets repealed, insurance companies will be able to discriminate again. And we've gotten so far removed from trying to solve health care. The Affordable Care Act has a number of problems, and Congress should get interested in trying to address those issues. Instead, you've got a president who's reducing the subsidies, which is driving up premiums for everybody else, is limiting the time for open enrollment, as well as the advertising trying to reach people, and then, of course, getting rid of the mandate is only increasing the cost for the pool of people involved. And so, we've got a flawed Affordable Care Act that is on, being starved by an administration that wants to see it fail. Meanwhile, there's legal action to try to continue to dismantle this thing. No one is looking out for the public's health or well-being. We should either try to fix this or we should move forward towards, a more of a single-player plan.
Sure. Well, let's just talk for a moment about it. It's not the whole Affordable Care Act that was deemed unconstitutional. It was just a portion. What is the portion, George, as a lawyer? What's the portion that was deemed unconstitutional?
I guess I don't know the answer to what specifically this particular judge said was unconstitutional.
Okay.
But that's typical of legislation that goes before the court. It's picked apart piecemeal, then a different court will pick another part of it, and then eventually when there's a conflict between the different district courts, they try to persuade the Supreme Court to take it, and the Supreme Court doesn't have to take it.
Right.
And the Supreme Court may decide to pass the buck. There are some control factors going on within the Supreme Court.
Sure. Well, I wish that the media would exactly specify, what portion of the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, and let the rest of it stand then. Because if the rest of it's not unconstitutional, we should be moving forward with that portion. It seems to me anyway. So,
I mean, it's, it makes people's heads spin. Just trying, and there's just too many stories out there where healthcare is inaccessible even at the premiums that are being offered, and people are having to make some bad decisions in their lives between what they're spending their limited income on. So
sure.
I would hope that we shouldn't be playing politics with healthcare, and I think the public is weighed in on the issue of pre-existing conditions.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Prison reform, you had mentioned that Evers is going to Lincoln Hills, which I too applaud him for that. He does want to do a solitary confinement. Now, is that, do you know, just in the prisons, the state prison system, or does that apply also to like county jails? Because I think they are very different animals.
Yeah, I don't know, but obviously this is something that I think there's a lot of interest in. Other states have been a lot more proactive than Wisconsin has at dealing with corrections reform. I think it was hard with Governor Walker. He was the truth in sentencing legislator in the 90s, and he had a hard time moving towards some smarter ways. And I do think there's bipartisan support. We did pass the juvenile corrections reform that I have hope for will reduce recidivism long term, and Governor Evers seems to want to be smarter about the money that we are spending and safer about the people that are returning to society, hopefully in better shape. So I hope he's advocating for certainly a more humane system, but the fact that he's engaged on the issue and isn't going to let the status quo that costs tens of billions of dollars, I think is a good sign. And hopefully there'll be something there that really respects our state employees that are really running on fumes right now and are put in a dangerous position every day.
Yeah, and county workers too,
Yeah,
for that matter.
absolutely.
I hope that Evers will take a look at our neighbor to the west. I mean, it's no secret that Minnesota has done some wonderful things, exactly the opposite of what Wisconsin has done under Walker, and they have much better positive things to report as a result of what they've done. Whether it's taxes, whether it's prison reform, whether it's education, I mean, they seem to be passing us all over the place on any given issue. So I hope that
Yeah.
Evers will take note of that.
I think the thing on corrections reform is that you can't do it overnight, and you need a
Right.
commitment to it over long term. And I'm hopeful that that's something we got started in the last session with the juvenile corrections reform bill, and that hopefully, an area of compromise going forward.
Okay.
And I might add that Tommy Thompson, who is somebody that we all know, and he served a long time as governor, conceded recently, in fact announced that the biggest mistake he made when he was governor is being so hard in the penal system on convictions and life meaning life and all of that sort of thing, that it turned out to be a terrible waste of money and humanity, and it didn't solve any problems. And I agree with him 100%, and I agree with you that we've got about the same population as Minnesota. We've got twice as many people locked up, and we're spending as much money on prisons as we are on education, and we're slipping backward in the education competition.
Yeah, clearly there are some people who need to be institutionalized in a prison or a jail, whatever the case may be. But then there are very good programs out there that help to rehabilitate people that I think those who can be rehabilitated could benefit from these programs. But it's a matter of developing the programs if you don't already have them in place, and then it's a matter of finding those who would benefit from them. And the other part of it is not locking people up to begin with for some crimes that some people may just feel are not all that terribly significant.
Well, I think that Walker did not even have a pardon board.
That's right.
And,
Really?
And parole became virtually non-existent under Walker. So for the prisoner, that takes away a lot of the incentive to rehabilitate himself, educate himself or herself, and become more useful for society. It takes away hope. It seems to me to be a very stupid way of solving what is a major problem throughout the country. And I think that Minnesota has the different direction that they're looking on those particular issues. I believe very strongly in pardon and in parole and incentives for someone in prison to improve himself and get ready to support his family when he gets out.
All right, fantastic. Election or campaign finance reform. We've talked about this a number of times when you've been on. You and I have discussed it, George. One thing that I'm going to continue to harp on is why can we not, if we're going to start talking about campaign finance reform, election reform, whatever you want to call it, why can't we do something about these organizations like the Koch brothers and other PACs that are funneling money, millions of dollars, into these campaigns, and they're telling outright lies. It's not just that they're little fibs. They are telling outright lies in some of these ads. Why can't we stop that? Whatever happened to truth in advertising, slander? Why can't we get a handle on this?
And it's only gotten worse, especially with this president. There doesn't seem to be any consequence for not telling the truth. Look, the floodgates are open. The Citizens United decision that says spending is free speech has essentially allowed the most powerful 1% of individuals in the country, in the world, to shape the outcome of our elections, to shape the court by shaping the outcome of our elections, and that makes it really difficult. And I think that's why the public is frustrated with the policies that they largely seem as not serving them, and a system that doesn't seem to be focused on their best interests. We deserve better. We at least deserve disclosure, transparency, but obviously a politics return to the public. I think you're going to see Congress, with the new control by Democrats, leading with some real forceful campaign finance reform, hopefully to restore some of that trust in good government. In the Assembly, we're going to lead with redistricting reform. This was one of the biggest Democratic elections in the last 20 years, and Scott Walker still won 63 Assembly seats. I don't know what else to say. The
Right.
courts have ruled that our maps are unconstitutional. We should have politicians getting elected by the voters, not picking their voters. And right now we have a system that has cooked the legislature as is. With Governor Evers elected, they can't do that going forward. And I'm hopeful in 2022 with new maps we'll have a more competitive system.
Okay.
That would be good. And of course, we have to keep in mind that when the Democrats were in power, they weren't in a big enough hurry to get rid of the gerrymandering. I mean, we have to understand that it all comes around.
I was a sponsor of the bill for nonpartisan redistricting. I was ahead of my time.
Yes, you were.
We've only got a few minutes left. I do want to address this question to you, Gordon, because I think that this is something that Madison can accomplish. I don't know how easily, but we see people speeding down highways, going well over the posted limit. We see people speeding through roundabouts. I have long been a proponent of cameras, photo enforcement. It has worked in other places. Illinois has done it in some of its construction zones. The state of Arizona has it in many places, and it's very successful. It's successful in a few different ways. It keeps your officers safe because they're not out there having to make traffic stops. B, it protects them, it helps your budget because they're able to do other things rather than traffic enforcement. And C, it really bumps up those coffers, There is indisputable images of you speeding or running a red light or whatever the case may be. I've been told that camera enforcement might be unconstitutional or invasion of privacy rights somehow. If other places can do it, I don't know why we can't. Do you see a day when we'll ever have some serious discussion about this?
So a number of years ago, I think it was about 8 years ago, I was on a committee that had a hearing on a red light camera bill that would allow municipalities to have red light cameras, I believe it was. And of course, you had proponents that made a lot of the cases you did, and you had opponents that showed accident data. You're talking about speeding. This one is where someone maybe blows a red light and accelerates through or slams on the brakes because they see the camera. I think, that's somewhat different. I will say that there is a little bit, and I don't know if it's about our, what it is about our culture, but we are sort of Fourth Amendment people. We are, have privacy issues here in our state that there seems to be sort of a bipartisan hesitancy at the addition of more cameras, especially in this world where privacy seems increasingly under attack. I do think in work zones and some other things, there's some great considerations to be made, given how much we ask of our existing law enforcement and how much we want them to focus on things. But I'm sure George could highlight some of the other potential legal issues that are out there. But you open the floodgates when you start having cameras and what they can be used for and what's monitored and what's not.
They're all over the place anyway.
They're all over the place
So-
anyway. But I think these things will be brought up and perhaps debated. But it has been a while. I know there was a bill. It didn't go anywhere, and I think it didn't go anywhere because there were those concerns raised over privacy.
Okay. We've only got a couple seconds left.
Well, I agree. I think that cameras on policemen have made a big difference in terms of safety and in terms of honesty and in terms of accuracy, and have protected a lot of people who claimed the police officer was doing something illegally and they did or did not have a gun. But Gordy's right that we have to work through the constitutional mess to find out how far we can go.
All right. Well, let's do that. Because I would like to see it. I really would. Like I said, cameras are everywhere anyway, so we may as well put them into a place where they can do a lot of good and keep people safe while raising money at the same time, because God knows Wisconsin could use it. So anyway, thanks, guys. This was fun.
It was.
A good way to start the beginning of the
Happy
year.
New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you guys as well. And that's going to do it for us. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.